Good morning and welcome to Teach Me Bees. Today we have with us special guest Dr. Lawrence of WSU. We also have Scott the Beekeeper, and I'm Dave Westcott, your host. Thank you so much for joining in this morning. Dr. Lawrence is an absolute expert when it comes to bees and keeping and Varroa and all of the things that you need to know about bees. We are very excited to have Dr. Lawrence on the show this morning. Good morning.
Morning.
We're talking about bees and pollination, and specifically an article in 2023, which kind of encapsulates looking at one of the worst years for honeybees in nearly 2 decades. So 2023. So what spurred you to write the article?
This whole article evolved. I wrote it initially to other WSU Extension personnel. My concern after just my contacts within the bee industry, that they're experiencing extremely high losses, and there is a shortage of bees that to make up. So my initial intention of the article was to give growers a heads up that they need to be in contact with their beekeeper, especially crops that bloom earlier in the year, like the apples, cherries, pears, but also blueberries in terms of availability of beekeepers. And the problem was manifest in that beekeepers in November and December of last year were experiencing relatively high loss rates, up to 90% loss rates in some operations. Wow. And this is not always, it's fairly typical and common for beekeepers to experience some pretty high losses, but they usually make up those losses by buying bees out of Florida. But in October, September, October of last year, there was also a hurricane in Florida, which went right through Fort Myers area, Central Florida, which is a major bee producing area. And that's where beekeepers in California and other parts of the country in almonds, if they have a shortage, will buy bulk bees from Florida beekeepers, and they simply were not available. There were some available in the Florida Panhandle, so it wasn't a complete disaster, but it made it for an exceptionally bad year given the losses and the inability of these beekeepers to be able to make up those losses prior to the almond pollination. But that would translate then to additional bees being not available for pollination purposes. So that was its initial purpose, but then it was picked up by WSU media team and picked up by a number of other entities in terms of the concern about the loss of bees. But it was a bad year. But I also, in the article, and I'm not sure which version you read, but I predicted that given the high amounts of rainfall, which was another problem last year, was the early heavy spring rains in California, but that could also have a silver lining in that it could be a good honey year later on in the year. But the biggest concern was lack of pollination, bees available for pollination on those early fruit crops in Washington, Oregon, and other places. So, and that turned out to be true. I mean, it was a halfway decent honey year in many parts of the country. So while it started out slow, beekeepers make bees, and they were eventually able to catch up. But the concern really was availability of bees for pollination.
Yeah, it was a fascinating article. I'm not sure which version we read either. I think it was it was what was put out by WSU. I think it was. Yeah. I think it's probably by the media team, but it was a great article. And we are beekeepers, so that's what we do. On a daily basis is production of honey. We pollinate. We want our bees pollinating the almonds in California, so on and so forth. So when I read it, it can have kind of a scary outlook to it. This is kind of stressful. So as a, and I think a lot of our audience is like the local beekeeper. From studies I've read, and if once we get on Google, and we're going to see a different percentage rate for everything that we do research on, but some of the information that we found has said that in North America, 90% of the honeybees that are actively pollinating are from beekeepers, whether it's commercial or backyard, the majority of it being backyard beekeepers with 1 to 2 hives. I don't know if that data correlates with the data that you have, but that's kind of the data that we work off of. With that being said, what are some of the tips that you would give us as beekeepers, whether it's commercial or backyard? What should we be doing to protect our bees, to ensure that we don't have hive loss? What are some of those things that you see?
Well, it's Varroa. That's, and the implications as a result of that, parasitic mite syndrome that gets in the way. But it's really around Varroa and the diseases, secondary pathogens that occur as a result of the Varroa infestation. So, I received a call from a hobbyist beekeeper in Coopville yesterday, and he wanted to know why all his bees were dying. And it's Varroa, and if you don't get the Varroa under control, then the secondary viruses and bacterial infections take on, and you start to get that parasitic mite syndrome. That once it hits that point, it's almost too late. The pathogen loads and the immune system suppression of the bees is compromised, and you're pretty much fighting a losing battle. So unless you keep control over Varroa throughout the year, you're probably going to run into problems. You're probably going to run into problems even if you do keep control of Varroa, but perhaps less so. It's a tough. When I started beekeeping back in the 60s, it was a lot more fun than it is now.
So you are actually a beekeeper yourself?
Oh yeah. I started keeping bees when I was 12. I've worked in commercial beekeeping, pollination, honey production. Then I transitioned to academic research, and got my undergraduate degree in apiculture and pomology at UC Davis. Then I went off in a little bit of different direction, but my doctorate is in human dimensions of environmental sciences, and I've tried to apply that to the bee industry and the human dimensions of honeybee industry, and what are we doing to bees as humans. And it's just amazing from how beekeeping used to be to how beekeeping is now, especially on the commercial level. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of these HiveWise programs where they now have robots that are, these bee houses that are completely mechanical driven, that where no beekeeper ever touches the bees. It's all done mechanically with, taking pictures of the brood frames and looking for disease and thermal regulation, and it's completely controlled robotically.
Wow.
And even before this robotic thing, the way beekeepers, in Florida, they drive truckloads of bees into a warehouse, split them apart, divide them up into so many frames of brood and honey and pollen, put them back on a truck, and off they go to California. Super production, industrialized beekeeping. So when you say as a commercial or a backyard beekeeper, I really differentiate. There's completely two different types of beekeeping, and probably more subsets within that, of migratory beekeepers and backyard beekeepers that don't move their bees very much. Very, very different strategies that need to be employed, and different techniques that go along with that. So the commercial guys are on a regiment of lots of treatment, and with a mixture of different chemicals being put in the colony almost continuously throughout the year.
So, first and foremost, it's awesome that you're on our call today. I mean, you are just a wealth of knowledge. I feel lucky to even be talking to you. So, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us. I found it interesting. Bees, beekeeping back in the day and beekeeping now. What is the real differences? Because I mean, I don't have that history or that knowledge. What was the difference then versus now, and which do you like better?
Oh, it used to be a fun. It goes back to Varroa, the introduction of the Varroa mite, and our inability to be able to adapt to controlling the Varroa. And part of that is the fact that the Varroa mite jumped ship, so to speak, from the Asian bee to the European bee, and there just hasn't been long enough for an evolutionary process to occur for the bees to develop resistance to the Varroa mite. And then we still have waiting in the wings, Trophoelaps, which will make Varroa seem like it's a cakewalk. So that is the biggest difference. And then the subsequent things that have happened as a result of that, and the beekeepers used to hate chemicals. Now it just amazes me, within a relatively short period of time, they totally embraced chemical control for Varroa, and the use of a lot of different chemicals, not all of them registered, or quite often not registered chemicals for the treating of the Varroa mite, and the fact that they have developed resistance rather rapidly. Mites develop resistance really quite rapidly, and we've seen that with a lot of the fluvalinate was one of the early chemicals used to control Varroa mite. It's totally ineffective now. Amitraz has been the choice of commercial beekeepers for years, and we started seeing this back in, really 2005 to 2010, where they went from only having to treat with Amitraz once a year to having to treat several times a year, and loss of effectiveness. But the chemical load in colonies now is pretty high.
That is, so with all of this treatment, how does that affect the human consumption? Like, if we are consuming this honey, does any of this affect us or get into us or hurt us, or is it, we don't know yet?
Well, a good question. Depends on how you feel about chemicals, but what was it in the Montreal Apimondia? Something like 65 to 70% of the honey was disqualified from the honey sampling contest, or because of either pesticides or adulteration of one type or another. So,
wow,
you can't find beeswax or foundation now that it does not have high levels of pesticides in it. The pure wax foundation.
Yeah, I started out my working career in landscaping, and the mission, 25 years ago, 26 years ago, was everything we do with weeds is we're going to take Roundup, we're going to mix it with water, and we're going to spray and kill all the weeds. We're not going to pull weeds manually. And, we're sitting there. It doesn't matter what company I worked for, but we're sitting there mixing Roundup. Nobody's telling you put gloves on. No one's telling you put a mask on. Nobody's telling you, do these things. We're just killing the weeds. And then, 15 years later, 20 years later, you've got massive lawsuits against Roundup because it's causing, significant amounts of cancer, within, people who work in agriculture. And at the end of the day, I wonder, with all of the chemical compounds being introduced into hives and to honey, will it begin to have a similar effect 10, 15 years down the road?
Well, we're getting into an interesting area. That's allegedly on Roundup. I've used Roundup in my bee yards since the early 70s when it first, and never have saw an adverse effect. It's a chemical that you have to treat with respect.
Yep.
And that's true with any chemical that you utilize. But, whether these, there's a loose correlation with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in Roundup, but by and large, it's one of the safer herbicides that we can use out there. And that's a topic for a different podcast.
Right.
But we did a study in 2013, 2014 looking at neonicotinoids, which folks were up in the arms about it. That's the cause of colony collapse disorder. And what we found was that there was very little contamination of bees in urban areas or in non-agricultural rural areas, but we did see moderate levels of neonicotinoid exposure in agricultural settings, which is, but none of the samples that we took out of the colonies using bee bread and wax exceeded 3 parts per billion. And that's well above the threshold. So the exposure level just wasn't there to cause significant problems. And you look at when I was a commercial beekeeper back in the 70s and the 80s, it was not uncommon for me to drive into a bee yard and see blankets of dead bees in the yard. It was relatively common.
Wow.
We had things like Pencap M and diazinon and a lot of different chemicals that cause huge problems. And we don't see that anymore. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a problem, but the sublethal levels that cause problems for bees are clearly there. But the level of contaminants compared to what it was in the 70s or 80s, there's no comparison.
Yeah. Where does a bee pick up the Varroa mite? Where is that coming from?
Well, it was introduced into this country, probably a pocket importation. I'm not going to mention names, but I have a clear idea of an individual, a large beekeeper in the state of Florida who almost admitted to having done that. So they brought it in. It was introduced, and then it takes a while for it to build up in large enough levels. But as we mentioned earlier, the reliance on bees from throughout the country for almond pollination, all of those bees come to California, and it's a perfect ground for being able to spread a parasite like the Varroa mite. And they go from colony to colony. There's drift. I remember I was in Lost Hills a few years ago and standing on a hill with some other bee researchers, and we looked at 80,000 honeybee hives, all in the same location. From where we were standing, we could see 80,000 beehives.
Wow.
And not a flower in sight because it was in January. And they were feeding the bees with large syrup tank trucks that, and the bees were just robbing in the air. So there's plenty of opportunity for the spread of diseases in commercial operations. And then that translates into the hobbyist beekeepers as well, because where do you get your package bees? Well, after the guys come out of almond pollination, they may be going to some other pollination, but a lot of them in California are shaken bees because they're building up strong, and those are going to have mites. Even if they put the pest strip in the colony itself to reduce the number of mites, you're not going to kill all of them. So that by the time you get your packaged bees, after a year, the populations are going to build up to high enough levels where the mites become a problem. And once they hit a certain threshold, it's pretty much all over. That's earlier.
So, man, that's some really good stuff. In your article, you mentioned CCD, which is colony collapse disorder, and you've made it. You what?
I hate that term.
You hate that term. Well,
yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that term and how it's connected to Varroa mites?
It is. The decline. We've had disappearing disease, we used to call it, with just absconding of colonies. But the varroa mite is really, by and large, what has caused the decline of honeybees at a higher level than normal. And what I think happened in 2005, 2006, is after 20 years of beekeepers putting amitraz in their colonies, you started developing the resistance. The mites started developing resistance, and they weren't treating often enough, and the mite levels just started to peak, and the pathogen loads were starting to develop. And that's what happened with the decline, and not knowing what it was. There's one paper that was published in 2010. I think Dennis Van Engeldorf was the lead author on that one. They found 60 variables associated with colony collapse disorder, none of which they said was the definitive cause. But I think now it's been pretty well recognized. While there are a lot of variables involved, it all starts from the varroa mite, and then our lack of ability to control the varroa mite.
How many hives do you keep today?
Oh, today we're down to about 30. For a while, we were running 300 on Whidbey Island but I'm trying to retire. And, I happen to be married to Susan Kobe, and that name may ring a bell with you or some of your listeners, but it's hard to get away from beekeeping if your spouse is Susan Kobe.
So you are in it no matter what. For good or for better or worse, you are into bees. So on your 30 hives, what are those just for fun? Do you sell the honey? No,
we use them primarily because Sue still teaches instrumental insemination, and so WSU has a program where we have been bringing in germplasm from Europe and Asia for several years now, and the process is that the semen would be imported into the United States through Seattle, and then up to Pullman for quarantine. And once they were released from quarantine, the semen was brought down to here to, or the queens that were inseminated with the semen from Europe were brought down here to Whidbey Island, where we'd propagate them and evaluate them, and then we would release those to bee breeders in California. So
okay, so
wow.
With your hives, how are you treating for varroa today?
Well, we like to use an integrated pest management approach, so we do a number of things. We do a little bit of drone trapping, where the varroa mites are more likely to populate drone comb. So we will put in drone comb and pull it out in 21 days after we put it in, just to reduce that population. That is marginally effective. We also use thymol prior to honey flow and when the temperature builds up, and then we will go with either Apivar or Apistan or some other product in order to keep the mites at bay. And then we still have losses. There are some bees that seem to do better and some that do worse. So we try and take an integrated approach, mix it up as best as we can, and not try and stick with just one treatment option.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome. Why did you start beekeeping at 12, or how did you get into beekeeping at 12 years old?
Well, I was not a very good student, and I wrote a book report on honeybees, and I got my first A ever. And so I was walking home from school shortly after that, and there was a rather large swarm in a tree, so I did what any 12-year-old would do. I went and found a saw from my friend's dad's garage and cut the branch off and walked home with this swarm of bees, probably 4 or 5 pound swarm. It was a pretty good sized swarm, and said, "Mom, I want to be a beekeeper." And
Did you bring it in the house?
and so then my uncle knew of a beekeeper who kind of helped me build my first boxes and get going. And I later bought his operation out.
Wow.
And then we started Vaca Valley Apiaries back in the 80s, where we did some breeding work. Our emphasis has always been on honeybee breeding and selection. I had the opportunity and the privilege of working directly with Dr. Laidlaw when I was at UC Davis and did an independent study with Dr. Laidlaw, who is kind of the father of instrumental insemination. And then we started a business, Sue and I, where we were actually doing instrumental insemination and selling breeders to California queen producers. So
Wow.
that's how it felt. And then along the line, you do honey production, you do pollination, and I got out of it for a while just because I didn't want to be a truck driver. I was starting to see that's what beekeeping is. You drive truck and you get up, work all day, and then you get up at night and you drive bees down to the melons or the alfalfa or whatever, and drive home and get as much sleep as you can. And what really hit it for me was Eric Musson, who was the extension guy in California for a long time, called me. I happened to be the vice president of the California Beekeepers, and so I got the call when Varroa was first found in the United States. And that night I moved a load of bees, and I, unloaded the bees in a cotton field right next to a melon that I was pollinating. And I threw my sleeping bag on the back to catch some sleep before I drove home. And I woke up to a crop duster spraying me with linden which was rather lousy smelling. And I just said, man, there's got to be a better way of making a living than this.
Wow.
So, I switched gears and went to the Ohio State University and got my master's and PhD there. So, then
Wow.
came back into it.
That's awesome. Ralph gave you a high five because he's an Ohio State guy
He's
too.
an alumni, yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to share something with you, and then I'd love to get your feedback. And so I started this beekeeping business, and I didn't have a lot of experience in bees. Okay, no experience at all. So I'm a construction guy. I do construction for a living. That's what I do all the time. And I moved out to Monroe, so I have a place in Monroe, and I've got 6.5 acres out here. And I needed to do something with the acreage, and I was thinking about it, and I was praying about it, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with this acreage. And a friend of mine had bees. He was a backyard beekeeper for like 20 years, and he was sharing with me about bees, and I was like, man, I'd love to make a bee farm. And so we purchased 3 hives from a commercial grower, and we have these hives, and we've ran these hives for maybe the last year and a half or something. And I said, I want to create a business because construction is hard. Business is hard. Business is tough all the time. Just like beekeeping is tough. Like the stories that you're sharing, like, hey, I was sleeping on the back of my truck and I get sprayed by a crop duster. Like, that's tough. Well, commercial construction is tough too. And I always think, man, I'd love for my kids to do something else. I'd love for my kids to do something different. And I kind of had this love for bees. And I said, my goal is I want to put 1,000 beehives. I want to have 1,000 beehives. And Dave, the guy I was working with, said, no. You're not going to do that. Let's do something different. And so maybe I move a little too fast sometimes, but I said, okay, let's do 100 beehives. Relatively not a ton of experience. We're working with a commercial beekeeper who's kind of a mentor type guy. And then we've got Scott, and he's, doing a lot of the legwork and keeping bees. But in April, we're going to have 100 hives on the property.
That's a lot for one location.
That's a lot for one location. And at the end of the day, this is my goal because I make plenty of money in construction. My goal was to start this business and then take the profits and then give them back to charitable organizations, because I like to help people. I came from a tough background growing up, and so helping people is really an important place. One of the places I love to help is a place called Dawson Place in Everett, who helps 1,100 sexually abused children a year. We donate tens of thousands of dollars to this organization. But my goal is to take all that profit and give it away. And two things. One, I'm giving all the money away, if there is any money, and I'm giving that away to help people. Bees are helping the environment. They're pollinating. They are, in rarity, if you will. And so my whole mission behind this, what I call the business Honey for Hope, is just to give back and make the world a better place from the environmental standpoint, from the bee standpoint, and from a charitable standpoint. And so that's the mission. And then I wanted my kids to have something that they could love, where they get their hands dirty and they work hard and they take care of things that are just not the computer, not the internet. And so that was kind of the motivation for me getting into bees, motivation for the podcast, all of these different things. And so in speaking with you, one, it drives a huge amount of fear, like a dagger into my heart, with, your experiences and what you've shared with me today. But two, in that process, like, I'm never going to get rich. I'm not trying to get rich with bees, but I love what bees do.
I guarantee you won't get rich with bees.
So what advice, like, you've heard this story, you probably hear these stories all the time of people who want to get involved with bees. You seem like a very straight shooter. There's no nonsense with you. What advice, based on what I've shared and told with you, what do you think about, what would you tell me that should be my next steps? What should I be doing on this journey?
Well, I'll just share my bias. Is I was asked to give a keynote presentation on a WSU work field day type of thing, and my opening sentence was how many spouses in here have their significant other wanting to be a beekeeper? Well, let me tell you the 100 ways or 100 reasons why they should not become a beekeeper. And, there are so many, people want to save the bees. They want to get into beekeeping. And that's great. But there are there are way too many people wanting to become beekeepers. And what we need is fewer good beekeepers. We need fewer beekeepers, but we need them to be excellent at what they do. Not everyone should become a beekeeper. The argument, and I'm going to talk to the master gardeners on Saturday, is the importance of planting flowers, of increasing habitat. And that's what we really are missing, is floral sources. And, even with the neonicotinoids and the pesticides, not all of those plants have pesticides in them. And so it's almost a solution to pollution is dilution type of thing. Plant flowers. If you really want to help bees, whether it's honeybees or native bees, plant flowers. And that's the single most important thing we can do. And encourage your jurisdiction to plant flowers. You can do so much more to helping bees in general, is to increase habitat. Now, if you want to become a beekeeper, then be passionate about it and understand it as best you possibly can. Get as much education as you possibly can, and understand the pitfalls, and understand the fact that stuff happens that are going to make your plans go awry. But, I strongly encourage, not everyone needs to learn how to do instrumental insemination, but you should know how to raise queens. You should be able to raise your own queens. It's a really a fun part of it. Honey is just heavy work, as you probably know.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of fun. it's fun when it's in the bottle, but getting it from the hive through the extraction process and into the bottle can be just a lot of work. But diversify as much as you possibly can. Don't be reliant on just pollination or just honey production. And if you're going to get into it, having either, I wouldn't go much more than 100 hives if I was you, or until you get up to 1,000, 3,000, whatever. When I was getting started, a big beekeeper on working your own, we had about 1,500 colonies when we had our operation. One person could do that. Not so much anymore. You have to scale up to a large scale. We're talking beekeepers now that have 20, 30,000 colonies and multiple employees in order to run those operations. No, I said, you're not going to become rich, become beekeepers. Beekeepers are doing very well, but they also have a huge cash flow that they run through. But they're getting $200 plus for almond pollination, and but how much are they actually putting into it? So it's an expensive endeavor to get into, and the learning curve is extremely high. So it's not the hobby that it used to be.
Yeah,
I think that planting your yard, planting your 6 acres in a variety of different floral crops, which is what we have out here at our place, is I have flowers blooming almost every month of the year. Probably at least 8 months out of the year, we have a good floral source coming in of one type or another.
What are your favorite types of flowers?
The ones that are easy to grow: Cilia, borage, various clovers. Poppies are a great nutritious source for bees. Clarkia is another good one that Neil Williams, who's a native bee guy out of UC Davis, wrote a paper where it has the highest nutritional value for bees. So those are the ones that are easy to propagate. Here, I live in a brassica quarantine area because they grow brassica for seed crop here, so they're worried about diseases. So we have to buy certified brassica. But we plant certified mustard seed and radish seed and all those, easy ones to grow and ones that will come back every year. But Facilia is a great one. I wish I could find a variety of alfalfa that I could buy at a relatively low cost to be able to produce a good alfalfa flow as well. But I haven't found a local farmer here has alfalfa, but I have to buy 50-pound bags of it, and 50-pound bags on 5 acres would be a lot of alfalfa to dump. So
that is a lot of alfalfa.
So trying to have a mixture of different plants in your area and even in your backyard. I mean, letting various floral sources come up. If you plant it, they will come, and you'll start to see more bees of different varieties of bees, not just honeybees, but also a number of native bees.
Yeah, for everybody listening, take that as a little bit of advice. If you want to help the bee industry, beekeepers, honeybees, other bees, plant some plants. Go back and rewind what you just heard on some plants you can plant. Dr. Lawrence, I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of an overview of the program at Washington State regarding beekeeping and what they do. And, we're here in Washington, and so I imagine a lot of our listeners are here in Washington. Could you just give us a brief overview of what that program's about, what it's like, what it's doing, for anyone who's interested in learning about that?
Yeah. It's going to go through a major transition here because Steve Shepard is going to be retiring this year. And my wife, Sue Kobe, who is also with WSU, is going to be retiring this year. And so the whole emphasis on genetics and breeding is probably going to fade away. Dr. Brandon Hopkins is currently leading the lab there, and their emphasis is on overwintering, so indoor wintering, ways of being able to improve that. They're also working on some mycelium for control of both varroa mite and improving the immune system of the bee. So that is probably the direction they're going to be heading into now. But I'd encourage you to invite Dr. Brandon Hopkins on to see what direction he sees the bee industry. But I think Sue and Steve will probably continue some of their work on bee improvement over time as in retirement. But the emphasis at WSU is going to be a little different now.
And is that something that is like a master's program at the college, or what is that like?
Well, there are some, there are undergraduate classes in beekeeping, but there are a few master's students, but also several PhD students. Paul Stamens, who is the fungi perfecti guy, who's helped fund some of the research on certain types of mycelium that actually have been shown to affect the varroa mite and also boost the immune system of honeybees. So Paul would be another good one to get to talk about that, but take some of what he says with a grain of salt.
Yeah, we will do that for sure. I've got one final question as we bring this thing in for a landing. So you're up in Whidbey Island, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Sometime would you be open to showing us what you do with the bees and the hives and all of that, or is that not something that you do? Or
most of what we do is instrumental insemination now and breeding of bees. So, yeah, if you can convince Sue to let me do that, we'd be happy to show you.
That's awesome. It's always the wife that's making those decisions. I've got the same thing going on in my house. But yeah, that's very exciting. It was an amazing call. You just have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information. It's been amazing talking to you. I'd love to continue talking to you as we continue to do what we're doing here. You're so insightful, and I'm just so thankful that we were able to spend
This has been great
time with you. It's been absolutely amazing, and just thank you so much for your time. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
Beekeeping is a great hobby if you have the time for it, but planting flowers is easy and probably overall better for the bees. So
awesome.
Feel good about planting flowers.
I love it. We'll feel
Thank
good
you.
about planting
That's good.
flowers, and we will enjoy looking at them. Scott, any final thoughts?
Man, this has been great.
has been
I'm
great.
loving the guests that we've been able to start getting on this show, and you've given us several names that we're going to reach out to and see if we can't get on here, because I think having a doctor on here is a step up from listening to me and you.
Yeah.
And so it's been very good. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence, for being on the show.
Yeah, just means piled higher, deeper.
There you go. And you've heard it from Dr. Tim Lawrence. Thank you so much. And listen, if you like this show, give it a like, give it a share. Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, any of those places where we are. I'm Dave Westcott, your host. Thank you so much for your time today.